Welcome to the Digital Planning Podcast. This series is designed to educate individuals about all things digital in connection with estate planning, business planning, and estate administration. To keep up with all things digital, please subscribe at iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, or wherever you download your podcasts. And now, Jennifer Ziegel, a partner at Kleinbart LLC, Ross Bruck, a principal of Estate Genie, and Justin Brown, a partner at Pepper Hamilton LLP, with today's topic.
Welcome back to the Digital Planning Podcast. I am your host, Ross, along with my co-hosts, Justin and Jen. Today, we are honored to be joined by phone by our guest, Rachel Zeldin. Rachel is the founder and CEO of Funerals360, an end-to-end online funeral planning service with the mission of being a comprehensive, consumer-centered resource for funeral planning, or in other words, a one-stop shop for information and organization, keeping the consumers and their pains and concerns as the guiding light. Rachel, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Ross.
So I think it'd be a good place to start with, can you give the listeners a little bit of background on how this came about, how you started Funerals360, and where you're currently seeing the intersection of technology and the death care industry?
Yeah, absolutely. And I get asked this question often, especially when people get a visual of me. They just don't understand how I'm in the business of funeral planning. I always like to start off by saying I am not a funeral director. I am not a licensed funeral professional, and that is on purpose. I'm just an average person that comes from an average family that experienced a death and was really disconcerted about the way that we were able to plan at that point in time. So kind of rewinding back to 2011, my great uncle Ray, who was kind of the black sheep of the family, but a super cool cat, as we like to describe him, died suddenly. And my mom was the one that actually volunteered to help make all of his funeral arrangements since he wasn't married and he didn't have any kids. And so I was kind of there as a support person for her, and I was just blown away by the lack of information online about funeral planning. And we're not even talking about a funeral planning resource. I'm talking about how to find a funeral home. Because at that point in time, there was less than half of the funeral homes in the country even had a website, let alone have a website that told you anything about what they do and what you can expect in terms of cost. It was very archaic. And so we were really, as a family, forced to go to a phone book and make a dozen phone calls and answer the same questions over and over again to the funeral professionals just to get to some really basic information, which was what are we purchasing and at what cost? And then even then it was pretty cloudy. And for someone, who grew up in an age of technology, and I use the internet or my phone to plan everything from booking a hotel to finding my next apartment, shopping for a house, going on vacation. I was just really perplexed as to why there was zero information online about funeral planning. That was really the impetus for me getting into this field, was just knowing how much our family struggled to get to, I think, basic information that was critical to decision making, and knowing that I now knew all this, but how did I share that with everyone else? So that's really where it all began, as kind of an innocent little idea. And as I pulled back the layers as I researched further and further, I just realized that the industry itself was super archaic and really did not embrace technology, and they really liked the way that things were, which was, you had to walk into their funeral homes in order to get any sort of information. So I was pretty determined to change that by providing an online resource that would help answer a lot of the questions that my family had. So that was back in 2011, 2012. And I was working in finance at the time, and I was completely dissatisfied with my career. So I thought, why not? And I jumped ship, and I started my first website, which was actually called I'mSorryToHear.com, and we went by that name for a number of years until 2017, when we launched our whole new website, which is Funerals360, which is really a a much more robust, comprehensive, and thoughtful solution for consumers and what you see online today.
So, Rachel, tell us a little bit about Funerals360. What do you guys do?
Well, our goal has always been to be the go-to resource online for funeral planning information and be a true friend of the consumer. Not that the professionals don't need help themselves, but there are dozens and dozens of other companies that cater to funeral homes and helping them with their own back office software and online memorial programs and how to arrange their showroom to maximize profits. I didn't really think that they needed that much help in terms of me helping them do business better, but I thought that consumers really needed to get the right information in order to kind of balance their sales and knowledge. So we are very much a consumer-first platform that we do our best to aggregate all the information that someone could need and provide the right interactive tools to help make your job easier as a planner, which includes aggregating all the funeral-related businesses across the country. So almost like you're doing a Google search, but in a dedicated platform where you know that the results that are coming back are going to be relevant. So you're going to have the funeral homes and the cemeteries and the headstones and the officiants all in one spot, so you can easily see proximity and you can make some quick cost comparisons and really get that overview of what a funeral could look like for you in your area. So that's kind of what we do in a nutshell, but there's many layers to that, as you can imagine.
So if I have a client who is in need of funeral planning, is this just geared to post-mortem? Is this just geared to individuals who are searching after the death of a loved one, or is there pre-planning as well available?
Absolutely both. The unfortunate truth is that most Americans do not do any sort of pre-planning, and so most families end up in at-need situations, which is just industry jargon as in someone's died. And so, a lot of the content is relevant to both parties on our site. So it doesn't matter whether you're planning in advance or you're planning at the time of need. You need the same information. We really hope to encourage pre-planning more and more, and that's a focus that we've taken on in the recent year and a half, is putting more of an emphasis on how to help people get ahead of the game. Because I think that, funeral planning or outlining your wishes is over half the battle. Most families, when they're planning in a time of distress, make really poor decisions because they just don't know what their family member wanted. So they either just go with the default that the funeral home suggests, or they emotionally overspend because they just don't know. But when people actually know what their family member wanted, they feel so much better making those choices, even if they are the inexpensive ones. So I really like to encourage that type of behavior with our audience and through partnerships that we are creating.
Rachel, does pre-planning require prepayment?
Great question. I love this one. And the answer is no, absolutely not. Pre-planning in itself is just, sitting down with yourself or with your loved one and saying, what do I want for myself, or what do you want with yourself when you die? And you start at the high level and saying, okay, I want to be buried or cremated or potentially even donated to, medical research or science. And then from there, what are the different sub-preferences that you have with relation to that? So simply going through that thought process and outlining the things that you feel strongly about is pre-planning.
Have you planned your own funeral?
Oh yeah. I have been crystal clear with what my preferences are. And I've also shared those with my husband and my sister, who I have entrusted with following through on these preferences, because there are definitely things that I don't want, and even though I'll be dead and I have no control over what actually happens, I don't want them sitting there guessing about whether that's what I wanted. So I'm happy to share those if anyone's interested.
I'm curious. Yeah, go ahead. Tell us what you do.
I'm probably abnormal, but I wish this was the normal. I want a green burial. So green burial can, I guess, have, it's not one straight definition, but a green burial in its purest form is having a death that is as environmentally friendly as possible. So what that means is number one, you're foregoing embalming of any kind. So if I have to be put on ice or kept in the refrigerator a few days before I get buried, that is perfectly okay. I just do not want to be pumped full of chemicals and then have that buried in the ground. I also want to forego a casket and a vault, and I want to be buried directly into the ground, either in a sheet or a shroud of sorts. And in a green burial scenario, there's actually an optimal level of digging that is done, and it's not 6 feet under. 6 feet under is for these monster, super heavy caskets that need a lot of dirt on top to prevent them from kind of rising to the surface. With a green burial, the optimal I think is about 3 to 4 feet, where the natural microbes in the soil and the air and the environment are optimized for decomposition. So you go back to Earth as quickly and naturally as possible. And I just think that it's, one of the most beautiful things that you could do for yourself and for your environment is that, you just kind of go back into nature. And you don't impact it in any sort of negative way. So those are my preferences at this point in time.
I realize this is a podcast about technology and planning, but can we go back for a second to the 6 feet under? The physics, that is why they're buried so deep, so that they don't later rise to the surface?
That is definitely one of the reasons.
Wow. I didn't know that.
Because,
did you know that, Justin?
Yeah, because the caskets have become so ornate. They're 200-pound pieces of furniture. And by the way, the reason why we employ vaults, or sometimes they call them outer burial containers, is it used to be marketed as a protected container for the casket, but you can't actually market it like that. It's illegal. What their real purpose is to keep the ground level so that the commercial mowers can more easily keep up the land. So that's why when you go to a really kind of a newer commercial memorial park, the land is meticulously manicured and all the ground seems really smooth and even. But if you go to an old church cemetery, the ground seems a little uneven or kind of rolling hills. And that's because a lot of them don't require or don't use an outer burial container. And so the land settles a little bit different.
Very interesting.
Wow.
Well, Rachel, I was going to shift gears a little bit. And you mentioned how technology is something that you use a lot. And originally, when you were trying to do research for your loved one, you relied upon technology. How do you think that technology is reshaping the death care industry?
Well, I think at this point, there's no denying the importance of technology. 7 years ago when I started, the industry balked at the fact that people would go online to search for this information. It's undeniable now, and I think that the technology that exists both for the funeral providers as well as for consumers is starting to finally come into its own. So, if you think back a couple of years, there was nowhere you can actually even buy a direct cremation online. You still had to go into a funeral home. Nowadays, there are certain players that are exclusively online providers that do all of the coordination online and post their prices online and make it super simple for people to purchase that. And then they do all that offline coordination for you. So that is something that, for me, seems so obvious and simple, but just only recently started to be available to consumers. And I I think that there's other technology that's like not online technologies that's really starting to shape the industry. And a lot of them that actually has to deal with green technology. So there's two new approved forms of disposition in the U.S., and I should say that in certain states in the U.S., because every state has to approve disposition forms. So cremation is a form of disposition, burial is a form of disposition. But in Washington State, human composting is now a form of disposition. And that was started as I don't know if I want to call it a technology company, but maybe let's call it a startup of sorts that wanted to promote environmentally friendly green burial practices, but in an urban environment. And they've created a architectural framework that allows for green burials in vertical environments that result in compost that you could take home and use in your garden or spread in like designated places. So that I think is really mind-blowing, and we'll see how successful that is in the coming years. And the other form of disposition, which is really kind of tech-enabled, is called biocremation or aquamation, which is most closely related to cremation, in the fact that a body goes into a chamber and then comes out as bone and kind of end product of dust or ashes. But instead of using flame and extreme heat like a typical cremation does, it uses a solution of water and alkali and some heat and pressure, and it rapidly decomposes the body to leave only bones. And then what's left is ends up being ground down into ashes and returned to the family, just like you would get in cremation. So I think that's also fascinating that that's now proved in 20-something states.
Why would one do that versus regular cremation?
Because it is so much better for the environment.
Okay.
And what is the cost differential?
The ones who offer this service offer it at the same price as regular cremation, because they don't want that to be a factor. And then they let the family choose whether they want kind of water or flame. So it technically probably costs a little bit more money because all the machinery is new. But if you were to go out and buy a standard cremation retort versus it's called alkaline hydrolysis, retort, they're both going to be $1 million machines. And so the more you use them, the lower the cost per service is going to be.
For users of your website, what would you say in terms of at least the last 18 months, the uptick in people inquiring about eco funerals and burials?
What's interesting about our site is because we do have 300 or so articles around funeral planning, is we get to kind of see what topics are of interest. And one of the top topics consistently is the truth about embalming, which is something that I actually, researched and wrote for my own knowledge. And I had no idea how many people were interested in that as well. But I think that's a really good indicator that people are starting to question, kind of standard practices and whether they're good for you and for the environment. So I think that's one thing. We also have a number of green burial articles that get, hundreds of views a month. But if you actually pay attention to, big media outlets, like the big news outlets, that's also a really good indicator. I would say that at a minimum once a quarter, there's an article in a major media form about green burial and the rise of a greener death. And I think that's speaking volume. And it's not just around the younger generation. It's actually, all the way up into the boomers who are saying, I want something simple and clean. And these things are really essential because without having this type of focus from the public, the funeral industry would not necessarily offer or promote these services. So I think it's great that there's more and more attention on the alternative options.
So a few minutes ago, you mentioned that back in 2012, there was a lack of reception to the idea of inserting technology into the death care industry or the funeral planning process. I'm going to assume that individuals, maybe funeral directors, maybe other people in the death care industry, were reluctant to see that. Has that evolved over time, even for people like funeral directors, or is it more of a consumer-based desire that you see evolving over this last 7 or 8 years?
Well, nowadays, if you go to research a funeral home online, you are more often than not going to find a website for them. So that's a win. I'd probably estimate that to be closer to like 85 or 90% of all funeral homes have a website, and the ones that don't are like really small providers who are just kind of there to do the funeral on occasion, and it's not like a full-time career. So, funeral directors have realized that they need to be online and they need to provide a minimum amount of information about their business. And whether that's for consumers' good or their own marketing good, I don't know what's the driving force, but I'm glad it's there. And there's also a number of companies, like I mentioned before, that kind of cater to the funeral industry and help them get websites. But those companies also help plug in different kind of like online technologies that help promote the funeral home, whether that's like social media marketing or helping them embed online memorials on their site or other type of tech-enabled services. So the funeral directors more often than not are using one of these providers for their websites, and I think it's because they realize that they can really capitalize on an online audience, and if they don't have that, then their competitors are. So it's become a little bit more competitive compared to 7 years ago or even 4 years ago.
Do you think funeral homes see you and see Funerals360 as a threat or as an ally?
I think they see us as like a pest, like a middle. When we talk to them, or like when I make a phone call and say, hey, we're working with a member who is planning a funeral, and I'd like to have some information from you. The conversation can go two ways, and I love when they say, sure, how can I help? But unfortunately, as often as I get that answer, I get the have them call me directly. We don't work with middlemen. And that's really frustrating because we're really working as like a family advocate. And, we're working on the family's behalf to make sure that they're getting all the information and helping them save time in getting that information. And when the providers aren't cooperative, it limits the choice for our members. And I don't know. I just think it's a shame that they have that perspective. But I think that that's sometimes how we're viewed as a middleman or someone that's meddling with their business, and we don't have a right to be.
So, Rachel, I'm sure you're very familiar that historically the mindset around death is, it's something to be avoided, it's something taboo to talk about, but of course it's a guarantee for all of us. And in the recent years, there's been more of a cultural mindset shift in terms of the death positive mindset, hashtag death positive, to really rebrand death as the ability to have end-of-life conversations in a more neutral setting, and also to really tout the aspects of life that people want to celebrate, when that triggering event comes or when their families are going to be in their time of need. Have you seen this death positive movement kind of become part of what you're seeing in the death care industry or helping shape it? Yeah,
I mean, I love the death positive movement and, the main faces behind it. It's good to have good publicity about death and not just think about it as like creepy and weird. Unfortunately there's not like thousands of alternative providers that have this mindset anymore, but there are certainly, a dozen or so across the country who strongly associate with the death positive and even, family-led funeral movement, which never existed before. So having these conversations and, just promoting that topic has enabled these people to, insert themselves into a traditional game and offer alternatives. So I love that. Yeah.
So, Rachel, as a planner, people sometimes come to me and ask me about their funerals. Mm-hmm. What should I, as a planner, be telling them in terms of how they can plan their funerals?
Well, you as a planner, I think, are in the best position to guide these conversations. I think that, many people maybe in your position would shy away from them because you're not super familiar with the topic. But, starting off with, just keeping that conversation open and saying, what did you have in mind? Or did you have anything in mind? Or any strong preferences about how you're cared for after you die is going to really help promote that conversation from moving forward. And knowing that there's tools like, Funerals360, which is why we developed a lot of the tools on our website, is to help promote the conversations and give people a way to document them and share them with loved ones. So you don't need to be the expert. You just need to know where you can go and find this information to guide those conversations further. And as a trusted professional as well, it's almost like your duty to help flesh this out further, because there's always a cost implication with a funeral as well. So if you're talking about life insurance and asset allocation, this is a time where you need to figure out, is this person going for a huge full-service funeral with all the glamour and pomp that's going to cost $20,000 and that needs to be budgeted for? Or is this person looking for something simple that might end up costing $1,500 that, you can simply tuck away into a little tiny trust or a payable upon death bank account so that the family is covered and understands what those wishes are. So I think it actually would be a great service to add on to what you're already doing is, guiding these discussions and making sure that, from a financial standpoint, that there's either a financial product already there that helps cover that, or that you can create one that encompasses those needs.
What mistakes are you seeing people make when they're planning their funerals? What could they do better? People
often just don't research at all. They will walk, especially when it's at need, whether it's expected or not. People make these same mistakes. So, the family that's, caring for a family member that's been on hospice or in the hospital makes the same mistakes as someone that has a sudden, tragic accidental death. But they tend to just go to the funeral home that they see in their neighborhood or that they've worked with in the past without even considering any of the other options available to them. And this is a huge mistake because, every funeral home needs to disclose their pricing, but number one, they don't need to disclose it online, so you're good luck finding that easily. But number two, just because they have to disclose their pricing on a price list doesn't mean that they're charging a fair or market rate. They are entitled to charge whatever they want for their services, and that's completely legal. So it's up to you as the consumer to do your homework and make sure that you're not grossly overpaying for the service that you're purchasing. And I've seen this happen so many times, even to people that I know, which is even more frustrating because I'm like, hello, I'm here. You could have just asked me. I have this data. But one of my friends whose father passed away, ended up paying $4,900 for a direct cremation, which is the simple, most basic cremation you can buy. And it's exactly the same no matter where you go. And had they just looked around the area or used our website to look around the area, they could have gotten the same exact service for $1,500. And not that they were hurting for money, but it just kind of adds insult to injury after the fact when you realize that you just got financially taken advantage of. So, the onus is on us to do our homework. And then even if you choose to use a higher price provider, at least you do it knowingly. So, I think that's one thing I really stress is, take the time, either yourself or through a service like ours, that's going to help you do that homework and get that overview locally. And at least you can get peace of mind on, that you've made a conscious decision. And along the same line, and especially today, I don't know if you guys are aware, but the cremation rate has surpassed burial. I think it was in 2017. So for the first time in history, more people are getting cremated than buried.
Why do you think that is?
Why? Well, there's so many reasons. I think culturally it's become more normal and accepted. I also think that it's because it's simple and flexible and inexpensive. When you get cremated, you can be buried in a cemetery and have something traditional, especially you're religious. But you could also be scattered. You could also be spread amongst family members, and everyone could do whatever they want with them. You could be created into a diamond. You could be, scattered at sea. And, aside from the actual cremation, none of that actually has to involve a physical funeral home or funeral director's services beyond, the basics. So that makes it far less costly. And then, again, the family just has so many options. If they want to wait 6 months to do a memorial service in Hawaii, they can, and there's not this time pressure. But I think why it's so important that, I mentioned that 50% of our population chooses cremation is that, especially when you choose direct cremation, proximity to you of a service provider doesn't matter anymore. If you're not having a service in a funeral home, then there's no reason to choose the one that's closest to you. You can use any of the providers that are going to service your area. So some of them will go as far as 50 or 75 miles, and they can be a fraction of the cost as your local funeral home. And so, again, if all they're doing is providing the basic services, having the cremation performed and returning the remains, then there is no need to stay super local and to overpay for that luxury. So I think that's something for people to kind of tuck away, is if that's the preference, it definitely pays to look beyond your immediate, 10, 15 miles from home.
So you were kind enough to share with us your last wishes for your end-of-life services. I will say, or let me ask a two-part question. First part is, I want a portion of my ashes shot into space. Is that doable? And then number two, and this is the more serious question here, how do you recommend people memorialize their wishes? Obviously, that information can go into a will, but a will's not always located before end-of-life services need to be determined, and it's not always the best place. So two-parter, one, can I do it? And then two, how do I make sure that happens?
Yes, there are space services that exist. And I think there's 2 or 3 that actually will provide that service. So you just have to do a quick Google search for that.
Any idea what the cost of that is?
Depends how much you're shooting up.
They are not inexpensive. They are a few $1,000s, I believe.
Oh,
and
I would have thought less.
Keep in mind, it's
more.
only a token amount of your ashes. It's not like you're sending up all of your remains or your whole urn. It's just like a token amount.
Did they do it with multiple, ashes at once from different decedents?
Yes, they would kind of have one launch date, and everyone would get on board at that point in time.
That's okay. I don't need my own rocket. That's okay.
Yeah, and well, they also have. I think I remember seeing something almost like a weather balloon service, where you go up to a certain point in the atmosphere and then are released, and then you kind of naturally disintegrate as you pass through certain layers of the Earth's atmosphere. So not quite as far as like super space, but like far enough where you could be, up there higher than we've ever been. So that's also a service I've seen. But going back to your second part, Ross, where's the best way to memorialize these wishes? First off, you should write them down. Some states require that it be in the will in order for it to be legal. So if you are in one of those states, got to put them there, but you also have to put them somewhere else. It could be as simple as literally writing them down and like sharing them, through an email or something with your spouse or your children, or your best friend if they're in charge. Or you can use a site like Funerals360, or there's another site called Everplans that like is more of a full-blown digital estate planning vault of sorts. Not so much funeral planning exactly, but there are other solutions out there that allow you to actually document these and then explicitly share it through email or link with other people, which I would just highly encourage, because it's not necessarily like it's personal, but it's not like personal information. No one's gonna take my funeral wishes and be able to do me any harm with those. It's just about letting people know and making sure that they have access to them at their time of need, and they don't have to go digging through a giant, file to just to find them. So I would definitely recommend both in your will if you're required, as well as online or offline with several people so that it's easily available.
I have one question for you, Rachel. What is the most expensive funeral you've ever seen?
I've ever seen? I've heard of funerals that have topped $20,000-$25,000, which blows my mind. But I don't think that's anyone that I know personally. Those have kind of just been, stories of people that I know. Although one interesting thing is that in certain countries, and not necessarily the U.S., but there's a number of African countries where people actually start like pre-planning and prepaying for their funeral, like in their late teens, because they end up like their goal is to have this big ceremony, which can cost tens of thousands of dollars. And so I know that is like common practice in certain countries, but not in the U.S.
So I do a lot of estate administrations, and we'll often see the cost for funerals and invoices for flowers and numerations for pastors or ministers, and of course for food and drink afterwards. And the largest one I've seen was about $45,000.
Wow.
Yep, it was pretty intense. They had several bands and string quartets during the service, and then afterwards it was very involved.
It was a real party.
And then got shot up into space.
It was a real
They had their own rocket. No, the rocket part isn't true.
It was a real party. And you know what? If the family has the means for that, and that or that person has set aside the funds for that, fine. But if it's, and that's not like a real party, like that you'd want to go to with really good food and dancing. But if you're just spending that sort of money and you're like just getting a basic funeral at a funeral home with a casket to the cemetery, that just seems like an extraordinary expense.
Oh, I agree.
So, Rachel, one of the things that I enjoy about representing executors and doing estate administrations is that you learn so much about the people who have passed away, and you learn a lot about the families of the individuals who have passed away. What have you learned about people in your role in the death care industry?
Unfortunately, I probably don't get to know them as intimately as you do, because as planners and estate planners and attorneys and executors, you really get to know the family on a personal level beyond just the death incident. for me, when most people come to me through a contact form or through premium membership service, it's usually kind of at their time of need, and I don't have any personal connection to them. So I kind of learn bits and pieces about the very end of those people's lives, but not really the whole life story. We created online memorials on our site as a way for people to share the life stories, in the hopes that, beyond the basic obituary information, people would want to share, a fuller picture of that person's life in photos and allow people to chime in. So it's one of those services that we would like to see people use more, so we can get better insights into, who they are. But yeah, definitely not as intimate as you guys get with your clients.
Do you have any final thoughts on this topic, Rachel?
I have so many thoughts on this topic in general, but I think that with relation to what you guys are doing, and it's so important, the work that you do with families, all the financial aspects of things, as well as just being a trusted advisor. I'd really just want to encourage everyone in your profession to think about the way that they'd approach this conversation with the families that they work with, in in a kind and compassionate way, so that you can encourage these conversations more often, and in a way get to know your clients better, but also just as a way to help their families be better prepared for the inevitable. I think that being in your position with the relationships that you have, you're optimized for having this type of caring conversation. So if it's not part of your routine practice, I would say, why not? And, what can you do, or what can we do to help you be better at having that conversation?
Rachel, thank you so much for joining us today. That was a lot of wonderful information you shared with us. We really appreciate your time.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, and thanks for having this conversation. I know it's not often the easiest, but I hope you got to ask some of the questions that have really been itching at you over the years.
Well, thank you to our listeners. You can catch us on the next episode of the Digital Planning Podcast. Again, today we were joined by Rachel Zeldin, the founder and CEO of Funerals360. You can learn more information and access a wealth of materials at Funerals360.com. Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Digital Planning Podcast, the podcast designed to educate individuals about all things digital in connection with estate planning, business planning, and estate administration. Please subscribe to this podcast and leave us a rating or review at iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, or wherever you download your podcasts. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.
This podcast is not intended, nor should be relied upon as legal advice, nor is it creating any attorney-client relationship with a listener and the hosts or guests. The information provided is only for educational and informational purposes, and the information provided will likely change.